And after the message, you can go home and continue your prayers for a pastor. Because I'm not it. So, as we start this morning, let's again ask the Lord to be with us as we worship Him. Dear Lord, we do pause before you, thanking you for the presence of your Holy Spirit, praying that you will enter our hearts and our minds as we approach you this morning. We thank you for being with us. In your name, amen. So I have 3 stories to share this morning, and then we'll be through. The first story is about 2 friends named Joe and Simon. And Joe and Simon were mountain climbers. Joe was 25, Simon 21, so they were young men, excited to face life's challenges. And they decided that they would like to go climb a mountain called Suala Grande. It's in Peru, 20,800 feet tall. That's actually higher than the tallest mountain in North America, which is Denali at about 20,300 feet. They thought it would be fun to go climb this mountain, and what you're looking at in this picture is the west face of the mountain, which had never been climbed before. And it's high, and it's steep, and it's cold, and they were determined to climb it. And so they set out very, very early one morning, and just before sunset, they managed to reach the peak of the mountain. And they were as excited as they could be. They had accomplished their goal. Well, they'd accomplished half of their goal. They needed to get back down also. So they started back down. It's starting to get dark. And the clouds are building. A storm is moving in. And perhaps they were in a little bit too much of a hurry. Joe was leading. Simon was laying out the rope. And it got a little too much slack in it at just kind of the wrong time, because a piece of the rock that Joe slammed his ice axe into to let himself down gave way, and he fell. He didn't fall too far, probably only about 20 or 25 feet. But when he landed, he felt his shin bones break and penetrate up through his knee. It was a devastating break of his leg. And they just started down. As he stood there on that little ledge, wondering what to do next, all of a sudden, we didn't have 2 equal mountain climbers. We had one mountaineer, and we had an invalid. What are we going to do? Simon climbed down. Joe explained to him what had happened, and Simon said, "We'll just do the best we can. I'm not going to leave you. We'll figure out something." So as they talked it over, they had 2 ropes. They decided they would tie the 2 ropes together, and Simon says, "I'll let you down." And they've got about 3,000 feet of really, really steep terrain to go down before it leveled out just a little bit. By now it's just about dark, and they start, and the way this works, Simon has a belay on his harness, but when he comes to where they've tied the 2 ropes together, Joe has to take the weight off the rope with his good leg so they can unhook, hook back on top of the knot, and then run it down through the second rope. And they do that, and it works. It's really steep. The snow's not very good. The snow's kind of trying to break away. But Simon is able to hold him. They do that time after time after time after time. They make it through about 6 rounds of that. And then all of a sudden, the knot hits Simon's harness, and the weight doesn't come off the rope. Unbeknownst to them, in the darkness, they've kind of worked their way around the side of the mountain a little bit, and Simon has very carefully let Joe over the edge of a cliff. And there's an overhang, and he is dangling in open space. He can't get back to the cliff. He can't take the weight off the rope. All he can do is hang. He tries to swing, can't swing in to get any purchase on anything. He can't reach the face of the rock. So he can't let the slack off the rope. The minutes go by. It doesn't get any better. Up where Simon is, he doesn't know what's going on other than the rope is still tight. And as he sits there, he feels the snow around him start to give and start to slide and start to move. And he realizes the snow's about to give way, and Joe's weight is going to pull both of them over the edge of the mountain. The good news was that he remembered his knife. He digs his knife out of the pack, and he cuts the rope. And, well, he cuts the rope. And you can imagine what happened next. We're going to talk about an anchor today. Who is your anchor? Quite happy that my anchor was not Simon. We're going to spend some time in the Gospels. And everyone says, well, we've read the Gospels ever since we were little. We know everything there is about the Gospels. We can name the Gospels. We know there are 5 of them. And what can we learn from the Gospels today? And I know that you've thought about the different themes of the Gospels. Of course, Matthew's theme is Jesus is King. Mark's theme, Jesus is a servant. Luke's theme, Jesus is the Son of Man. John's theme, Jesus is the Son of God. And finally, don't forget Revelation's theme, the coming judgment. And Jesus is the judge. But we're going to start in the book of John. John chapter 1, verse 1, because where else could you start? But in the beginning. One of my favorite verses, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Can you imagine John penning those words after the destruction of Jerusalem, but before he was sent to exile onto Patmos, so it was probably somewhere around maybe 75 AD. By now, he has been a preacher, he has been a pastor, he has been a gospel minister for most of his life, for probably more than 50 years. And through inspiration, he sits at his little desk and he starts to write. He says, where do I start? Well, the other gospel authors kind of started with Christ's birth, or maybe they started with his ancestors. But John said, no, I think I'll just start in the beginning. In the beginning. What is in the beginning? This is just a picture of the Milky Way. And the Hubble Space Telescope has truly been one of the most spectacular events of astronomy during my lifetime, because the images free from Earth's atmosphere are simply spectacular. So this is our little galaxy. This is the edge, looking up into the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. I don't know whose job it was to count, but our astronomers think there are about 500 million stars in our Milky Way galaxy. That's an awful lot of stars. And yet, on a dark night, not only can we see the Milky Way splashed across our sky, but if you know where to look, with your naked eyes, look up toward Andromeda, the Andromeda constellation, and what do you see? This faint cotton ball looking thing. Well, that's the Andromeda galaxy. And you can see that. It's just the next galaxy over. And you think, well, that's pretty fun. And you think about, let's see, the light that I'm seeing from the Andromeda galaxy left there 2 million years ago. It took 2 million years for that light to reach my eyeballs. And you start to think, wow, that's a long ways. I wonder what it's like now. And I just had to share this very recent photo that was released by the Hubble. The bright star in the upper edge is from the Milky Way galaxy. And then looking beyond that, we have galaxy, it's just numbered 103. Looking beyond that is yet another galaxy. It looks like it's running into it, but it's many light years beyond. And all the other little stars you see in this image, well, no, those aren't stars. Those are galaxies. So in this tiny little bit of space, I counted. There are hundreds of galaxies in this one image. And I try to imagine how many stars there must be in the universe. Well, again, astronomers said, well, we think maybe a couple of trillion. But actually, that's not stars. That's galaxies. Wow. In the beginning was the Word. Well, what's he been doing all these years? Well, I guess he's been counting the stars because he calls them all by name. Is that not awesome? He calls them all by name, and there's a whole bunch of them. I could rattle off a few names, but wow. That's my Jesus. That's the Son of God. That's the one who wants to have a relationship with me. He's the one who wants to sit down with me every morning, and he wants to hear about my problems. And then when we're through, maybe he has a few more stars to name. We're going to scoot over and look at just a few of the ways he referred to himself. In John 6, verse 3, he said, I am the bread of life. Then in John 8, just a couple pages over, he says, I am the light of the world. I am. We're going to keep going through John, and then we're going to come back and talk about one of John's stories. John chapter 10, verse 7. I am the gate for the sheep. Well, I knew he was the shepherd, but I didn't know he was the gate for the sheep also. Of course, also in John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. And now we get to our second story of the morning. Back just a page, John chapter 9. It's a story you all know, but perhaps we can pick up a point or two from this story. Picture Jesus. He's walking along with his disciples. He must be in Jerusalem. And in John chapter 9, verse 1, says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Verse 2, Rabbi, his disciples asked him. John is forever polite. He doesn't identify who asks the dumb questions. I wonder, I just think Peter asked this question. I could be wrong, but it just seems like a question Peter would ask. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? A or B? Was it because of his sins, or was it because of his parents' sins? Because obviously it's one or the other. Jesus does not say, thank you, Peter. In verse 3, Jesus answers, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. Jesus answered, this happened so the power of God could be seen in him. In verse 5, but while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. Then the story becomes interesting. What does Jesus do? He spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. Why? When I grew up, my mother had a name for me. She named me Bud Mud. And apparently I was a bit of an expert in mud. And I could get it all over myself, all over everything, all over my clothes, and then bring it all in the house. It takes quite a bit of water to make a mud pie. Make a good mud pie. Go outside when you get home this afternoon and spit. Well, you might have to spit more than once if you're going to make a mud pie. Jesus spit enough to get enough mud to spread it all over this man's eyes. Why? We'll come back to that. Verse 7, Jesus told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, if you've ever been to like one of the little programs at the academy or something, you have seen 1, you have seen 2, you have seen 3, they pull the curtain. The curtain gets pulled on this story. That's all we know. The man came back to where Jesus was and he could see. Now let's go back to the marketplace or somewhere, because in the next verse we have a new scene. The man's neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, hey, isn't this the man who used to sit right down the street there and beg? Isn't that the guy? And they had a debate. In verse 9, some said he was, and others said, no, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am the one. I'm the same one. Then they asked him, who healed you? What happened? And the man told them. The man they called Jesus made mud, spread it over my eyes, and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. That's the end of the scene. Because a bunch of these people, his neighbors, had a committee meeting. And they said, we don't know what's happened here. Something has happened. There's only one thing we can do. We better go catch this guy. And we're going to take him to the council meeting, and he has got some explaining to do. So then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. Uh-oh. We get to the meat of the story. Why did they take him to the Pharisees? Because it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud. Do not make mud on Sabbath. It was because on the Sabbath Jesus had made the mud and healed him. Why did Jesus make the mud? Why didn't Jesus just say, hey man, look at me, you're healed? We're going to go to another verse. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the book of John for a minute, but we'll be right back. But there was another blind man at Bethsaida, up the road in Galilee. And there's another story about Jesus healing a blind man. And if you study and put it together, this story happened on Sabbath 3 months earlier. Little quick short story. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Once again, a blind man comes to see, no big deal. Blind man comes to see Jesus. And once again, I know Jesus could have just said, blind man, open your eyes and you can see. Didn't happen. What happened? Jesus took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village. Then he spit in the man's face. I kid you not. It says, then spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and said, can you see anything now? And the man looked and said, this is the guy that saw the people looking like trees. And he said, yes, I see people, but I don't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around. Well, I've been kind of hung up on the trees walking around thing more than being spit in the face. Why did Jesus spit in the guy's face? We know Jesus had different ways of healing blind people than spitting on them. Because we're going to jump to Luke. Luke chapter 18. Another man. There were a lot of blind people back then, weren't there? Luke chapter 18, verse 40. As a man came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Well, this was the blind man outside of Jericho who heard Jesus coming, blind Bartimaeus. And Jesus gets closer and closer, and he keeps yelling louder and louder and louder, and everybody's trying to tell him, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. And he just yells louder, louder, louder. And finally they brought the man to Jesus. They couldn't get him to shut up. As a man came near, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, he said, I want to see. And Jesus said, fine. All right, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. Luke 18:43, and that was it. Why were these other guys different? You probably, well, maybe you don't know what that is. I think that one's in, that might be in near Capernaum. But anyway, that's a picture of something that was in most of the tabernacles back then. And it was called a seat of Moses. Well, why do we need a seat of Moses? Well, because if you want to make up your own rules as you go, if you have a seat of Moses and you're the priest of that synagogue, you can sit on the seat and you can say, I'm now sitting on the seat of Moses. Listen to what I say, because what I say is now a rule of God called a takanot. A takanot, it's an ordinance, and it's just the same as if Moses spoke it directly from God. So they would make up all the rules. By the time Jesus was walking around, there were more than 500 of them. And you had to keep them all or you were considered a sinner. Guess what? One of their favorite rules was, one of their favorite rules was, I don't know which priest did this, I'd kind of like to know, but they made up this rule: thou shalt not use saliva to heal anyone on Sabbath. That is in the Talmud. It was one of their rules. Gives you a little understanding why these guys got so angry. We'll go back to the blind man. Back to John's story about the blind man. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? The man answered, well, I think he must be a prophet. Not the answer they wanted to hear. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they tracked down his parents. They said, let's adjourn. We're going to bring your parents in here. We'll talk to them. And they asked them, parents, is this your son? Yes, that's him. Was he born blind? Yes, he was born blind. In fact, his parents said, chapter 9, verses 22 and 23, we know this is our son, and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. And so, in their infinite wisdom, once again, the Pharisees bring this man back in, and they say to him, we know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man, referring to Jesus, comes from. The blind man, we don't know that he was an educated man, but I thought he gave an educated answer in verse 30. Why, that's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. But the Pharisees were so angry. They were so mad. They were red in the face, and they couldn't see straight because their sacred takanot had been broken. And they knew it had been broken once before, and they thought maybe that was a mistake, but they were sure that this time, when Jesus used saliva to make mud and put it on this man's eyes, that it was not a mistake, and that he was intentionally poking one of their so-called sacred rules. And they were so angry, they were beyond reason, they were beyond listening. And so their response was the response of an angry person. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? Thought he was doing a pretty good job of teaching them. And they threw him out of the synagogue. Away with you! And don't come back. Wow. I hope I'm not hanging on to any little secret rule in my life that Jesus has been trying to poke at, and that I didn't want to listen to him. But for me, this gave me time to study my heart and say, Jesus, I don't want to be holding on any of these taconauts that you've been poking at. You've been poking them out, and I won't turn loose of them. So whatever they are, show them to me so I can get them taken out of my life. Because I want you to be my anchor. I don't want Simon to be my anchor. Perhaps I left you dangling on the mountain just a little bit. Or not. We're going to go back to the mountain for just a moment. Simon was devastated by what he'd done. They knew he didn't have a choice. He made it down the mountain. Once he got to the bottom of the mountain where it was kind of flat, it was still 8 miles to walk back to their camp where he and Broke-Leg Joe had been camping. And he got back to camp, and he wasn't in a big hurry to break camp and return to civilization. Among other things, he was trying to figure out exactly how he was going to explain all this to Joe's family. So he stayed in camp for 4 days. Finally, in the afternoon of the 4th day, he said, I guess I've got to return to civilization. So he started working on breaking down the camp, saddling up the pack animals to get all their gear out of there, because it was still 2 or 3 days with the pack animals to get back to where they could get a vehicle and then take the vehicle on in toward the city. And as he was finishing up his chores and about to leave camp, he heard something. And he looked, and he saw an animal crawling along the ground. And the animal was making strange noises. And then he realized it was not an animal, it was Joe. So, Broke-Leg Joe woke up in a crevasse. He remembered falling. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious. He was in a deep crevasse. You could see it was maybe 70 or 80 feet to the top of the crevasse. And he thought, oh no, I have pulled Simon over the cliff. And as he recovered his senses, he finally decided, well, I'm going to pull the rope because maybe his body will get stuck on some rocks or something up there and I can pull myself out of this crevasse. And he started pulling the rope until the cut end of the rope came down and hit him on the head. And then he knew what had happened. He thought, well, maybe he's still around somewhere. I'll call for him. And he called for him the rest of that night. No response. About 10 o'clock the next morning, he decided, I'm not going to just stay here, I'll die. He still had his backpack on. Apparently, he had landed on his backpack on a little snow bridge over this crevasse when he fell, and it had kind of slowed him down enough. Then he fell on down in this crevasse. And he knew he had an ice screw. He screwed it into the wall of the crevasse, but he couldn't go up. There was no way to go up. So he said, well, I don't know how far the bottom is. I can't see it. But he said, I'm going to let myself down, and we'll see what happens. So he didn't even put a knot in the end of the rope. He just fed it through the ice screw, through his carabiner, and he started letting himself down, knowing that he would either fall off the end of the rope or he would hit the bottom of something. And he hit the bottom before he ran out of rope. And he was able to crawl out the side of that crevasse at that point. And all he could do was start crawling. He crawled over 2 miles of crevasses and snow, and then 6 miles of boulders and debris from landslides and snowslides. And on the 4th day, he hadn't had any food, he hadn't had any water, and he was near his end when he realized that he could see a little bit of orange up over the next hill that was not natural. And he realized he had managed to crawl back to camp, and he realized that there must be someone still there. And indeed, Simon was just leaving, was able to strap him to a horse, and 11 days after his fall, he made it to the hospital. Our story, written by John, is not quite finished either. Because you see, Jesus ended up hearing about all these things that had gone on. Back and forth, the neighbors clamoring, "Who is this man?" The Pharisees throwing him out of the temple. And when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The blind man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." "You have seen him," Jesus said, "and he is speaking to you." Max had a to-do list. Many of us have to-do lists, but it seems like the things we really don't want to do very bad can get shuffled down that list. Shuffle, 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 shuffle. But finally one day, that one item that keeps bothering us ends up at the top of the list. You say, "Okay, I'm going to do it today." And that's what happened to Max. The item on the list that he had kept shuffling down had to do with a credit card. There was a little problem with a credit card, and he was going to have to call the credit card company. You blame him for shuffling that down the list. He said, "I'm going to do it." He calls the credit card company, and the nice attendant on the other end answers, and he says, "I have a problem with my credit card." And she said, "Please tell me your name." He said, "Well, my name is Max Lucado." And she said, "No, the Max Lucado? The one who writes books?" And he says, "Well, yes, I'm that one." "Oh," she says, I always keep one of your books on the side of my bed. I've been reading your books for years. There's so much encouragement to me." Then she just starts to cry. Weeping, crying, and it goes on, and it becomes a little bit uncomfortable on the other end. But after a minute or two, she finally regained her composure, and she apologized. She said, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to cry." He says, "It's all right. What's going on?" She said, "I had a doctor's appointment a little while ago, earlier today, and I was given some really bad news. And I had to come back to work, and as I got back in my car, I tried to call my husband. I just had to talk to someone. There's no answer. I tried to call my son, and there was no answer. I got back here to work. I got out of my car. I'm walking in the building, and I'm just saying, Lord, I need to share my burden with someone. Give me someone I can talk to. Just please, Lord, hear my prayer." She said, "I came inside, I sat down at my desk. You were the next phone call. Who is your anchor? John says, these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. That is why these stories are written. That's why we have these scriptures. That's why He wants to be your Savior. Jesus says, abide in me, and I will abide in you. He is my anchor, and I invite you to ask Him to be your anchor. Thank you.
Sing a song.